Margaret Davies stood in the afternoon sun of a November day in 1877, watching her daughter Catherine sketch the hillside with a piece of charcoal on brown paper. The girl was 14, with her father's steady hands and Margaret's determination, both of which they would need for what came next. Behind them, the half-excavated slope showed where they'd been digging since September, when Margaret had filed her claim on this quarter section along the Sweetwater River in Wyoming Territory. "It won't work, Mrs. Davies," said Robert Fletcher, the nearest rancher, a weathered man of 50 who ran cattle on the benchlands to the west. He'd ridden over when he'd heard what she was planning. A woman alone with a child, trying to dig into a hillside and raise sheep for dairy. You should find a man to marry or go back to your people in Ohio. Margaret had heard similar advice from her sister in Cleveland, from the land agent when she'd filed her claim, from Reverend Thompson at the small church in Laramie, where she'd attended twice, before the ride became too far to manage regularly. Her husband, William, had died 18 months earlier from injuries suffered when his horse fell during a storm. He'd left her with Catherine, $60 in savings, and a dream he'd talked about for years, building a sheep dairy using methods his grandmother had described from Wales, where families built into hillsides and kept their livestock below them through the winter. "The sheep go on the lowest level," Margaret said, not arguing, just explaining. "The warmth rises, living quarters in the middle where we can tend them easy. Cheese room on top where it stays cool but not frozen. The earth holds the temperature steady." Fletcher shook his head. "Even if the idea was sound, which I doubt, you're 2 people. This kind of excavation needs 6 men and a month of work. Winter's coming in 3 weeks, maybe 4. "We have help coming," Catherine said quietly, still sketching. "Mr. Garrison said he'd bring his sons." Margaret glanced at her daughter, surprised. She hadn't known Catherine had asked anyone. Robert Garrison was a widower who'd settled 5 miles south, running a small horse ranch with his 2 boys, both near-grown. Margaret had met him twice, once at the general store, and once when he'd helped her fix a broken wagon wheel on the road. He'd been kind both times, respectful, and hadn't offered unwanted advice. "Garrison's a good man," Fletcher admitted. "But Mrs. Davies, even with help, you're attempting something that goes against every principle of sound construction. Buildings sit on top of ground, not burrowed into it like some animal den." "In Wales, they've done it for centuries," Margaret said. "My husband's grandmother lived in just such a place. Kept 12 sheep, made cheese that sold in Cardiff markets, raised 6 children in a space no bigger than a standard cabin. She told William the earth was a gift if you knew how to use it." Fletcher studied the excavation, the careful way Margaret had measured and marked her levels, the drainage channels she'd already dug to carry spring melt away from the structure. Finally, he tipped his hat. "I hope you prove me wrong, Mrs. Davies. I truly do." After he left, Catherine looked up from her drawing. "Mother, will Mr. Garrison really come?" "Did you ask him?" "I asked if he knew anyone who might help us. He said he'd think on it." Margaret put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Then we keep working, and if help comes, we're grateful. If it doesn't, we work slower and longer." But help did come. 3 days later, Robert Garrison arrived with his sons, Thomas and James, young men of 19 and 17. They brought tools, timber, and a practical assessment of what needed doing. "Show me your plan," Garrison said without preamble. He was tall, lean from ranch work, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that assessed problems the way a good carpenter measures wood. Catherine brought out her drawings. She'd sketched the 3 levels in cross-section, showing how the lowest chamber would house the sheep, 8 feet high with ventilation shafts. the middle level for living quarters with a fireplace whose chimney would run up through the cheese room, and the top level partially above ground for proper cheese aging, cool and dry. "Your daughter drew these?" Garrison asked. "Her father taught her to draft," Margaret said. "He was a carpenter before we came west." Garrison studied the drawings for several minutes. Thomas and James came to look over his shoulder. The boys had their father's build, solid and capable. Thomas, the older one, traced the ventilation system with his finger. "This could work. The airflow's smart. The excavation's the hard part," James added. "Getting the levels right, the drainage proper." Garrison looked at Margaret. "How deep have you gotten?" 12 feet at the back wall, 6 feet forward. I'm cutting it in terraces, like steps. Then I'll level each floor as I frame it. You're doing this work yourself? Catherine and I together. We manage what we can each day. Garrison handed the drawings back to Catherine, but he spoke to Margaret. We'll help. My boys need to learn different methods of building, and I'm curious to see if this Welsh design holds up to Wyoming winters. But I won't do the work for you. We'll work with you, and you'll need to keep pace. Over the next 6 weeks, they excavated the hillside. Margaret and Catherine worked from dawn until they lost the light, and the Garrisons came 4 days out of 7 when ranch work allowed. They hit bedrock at 14 feet, which Garrison said was fortunate. It gave them solid foundation for the lowest level and meant drainage would flow around the structure rather than under it. The work was harder than anything Margaret had done, digging into earth that fought back with rocks and roots, hauling away the excavated soil, shoring up walls with timber supports until the permanent structure could be built. Her hands blistered and calloused. Catherine, slight for her age, pushed herself to exhaustion daily and came back the next morning, ready to work again. Other neighbors came by to watch their progress, some out of genuine curiosity, others to witness what they expected would be a spectacular failure. Martha Hendricks from the homestead to the north brought bread one afternoon and stayed to ask questions about the design. "You're really putting the sheep below ground?" Martha asked, watching Catherine measure the depth of the excavation with a marked pole. "The warmth rises," Margaret explained again. "In Wales, they've done this for generations. The animals stay warmer, use less energy maintaining body heat, produce more milk. And you'll live in the middle level, between the animals and the cheese? The heat from below keeps us warm. The heat from our fireplace rises to keep the cheese room at the right temperature for aging. Everything works together." Martha studied the excavation thoughtfully. "My husband says it's madness. But then he said women couldn't file homestead claims either, and you did that too." She smiled. "I'll be interested to see if you prove him wrong twice." As November progressed and the excavation deepened, they encountered challenges Margaret hadn't anticipated. A seam of clay 15 feet down meant they had to dig through material that stuck to their shovels and required twice the effort to remove. A pocket of loose gravel nearly caused a wall collapse until Garrison showed them how to shore it properly with timber bracing. "Every structure teaches you something," Robert said as they reinforced the unstable section. "The question is whether you're willing to learn." Margaret found herself learning constantly about soil composition, about water flow, about the precise angles needed to ensure stability. Catherine absorbed it all, sketching modifications to their original plans, calculating load distributions with the mathematics her father had taught her. "She's got spine, your girl," Garrison said one afternoon, watching Catherine lever a rock out of the excavation with a pole and wedge. "Reminds me of her mother." Margaret, covered in dirt and sweat despite the November cold, looked at him sharply, but his expression was matter-of-fact, approving without presumption. By early December, they had the excavation complete, 3 levels cut into the hillside like giant steps. The lowest chamber was 20 feet deep into the hill, 16 feet wide, 8 feet high. The middle level, offset forward, gave them living space of 18 by 14 feet, with a ceiling height of 7 feet. The top level, mostly above ground but bermed with earth on 3 sides, would be the cheese room, smaller at 12 by 12 feet, but with the height needed for proper air circulation. "Now comes the real test," Garrison said, "framing this so it doesn't collapse when the earth shifts come spring." They built the frame using lodge pole pine from the mill in Laramie. The back wall of each level sat directly against bedrock or the cut earth face, lined with flat stones Margaret and Catherine gathered from the river and fitted tight. The front walls and floor joists had to carry the weight of earth berms, while allowing for the heat and ventilation flow between levels. "The sheep heat rises to warm the living quarters," Catherine explained to Thomas one afternoon while they notched floor joists. "And the cooking heat from our fireplace rises to the cheese room to keep it from freezing but not too warm. It's all connected." Thomas, who'd been skeptical at first, had become a believer in the design. "It's like the whole structure breathes together." Margaret was inside the middle level, building the fireplace from riverstone and clay mortar, when she heard voices above. She climbed out to find Reverend Thompson standing with Garrison, looking at the construction. "Mrs. Davies," Thompson said, "I've heard remarkable things about what you're attempting here." "Just trying to make a living, Reverend. Robert tells me you're building a sheep dairy using some old Welsh methods." "My late husband's family knowledge, yes." Thompson walked around the structure, examining how the 3 levels stacked, how the ventilation shafts ran from the sheep chamber up through the living space and cheese room. "I confess, I came here with concerns about a woman undertaking such a venture without proper male guidance. But this is thoughtful work, careful planning." Margaret waited. There was usually a but coming. "I wanted you to know," Thompson continued, "that several families in the Laramie congregation have asked about you. They're impressed by your determination. If you need help with the sheep, with supplies, with anything, you have friends willing to offer it." After he left, Garrison said quietly, "You're changing some minds, Margaret." It was the first time he'd used her Christian name. She didn't object. By mid-December, they had the structure framed and the roof on. The cheese room roof was simple, cedar shakes over solid planking. Below it, the living quarters had a plank floor that would allow heat to rise while keeping the cheese room clean. And below that, the sheep chamber had a floor of packed earth covered with straw, with small gaps left in the planking above to let warmth rise. "We need to test it before winter truly hits," Margaret said. "James, could you help Catherine bring the sheep down from the upper pasture? We should move them in tomorrow." She'd bought 6 ewes from Fletcher back in September, hardy animals with thick wool, the kind used for both meat and dairy in the old country. They'd been grazing the hillside grass, getting fat for winter. That evening, with the sheep settled in their new quarters below and a fire burning in the living space, Margaret invited the Garrisons to stay for supper. It wasn't much, rabbit stew and biscuits, but the warmth of the space surprised them all. "It's 65 degrees in here," Garrison said, checking the thermometer Margaret had hung on the wall. "And it's 20 degrees outside." "The earth holds heat," Catherine said proudly, "just like the drawing showed." Over the meal, they talked about the next steps. Margaret needed to build proper milking stations in the sheep chamber, set up the cheese-making equipment in the upper room, seal every gap and crack against wind. Thomas and James would help with that, they said. Their father sat quietly, watching Margaret talk about rennet and aging times, and the markets in Laramie, that might buy her cheese. When the Garrisons left that night, Robert lingered a moment at the door. "You've built something remarkable here, Margaret. William would have been proud. I couldn't have done it without your help, Robert. You and your boys. We'll be back day after tomorrow. There's still work to finish before the real cold comes." The real cold came on December 28th. Margaret had been tracking the weather signs, the way the horses moved restless in the upper pasture, how the birds had fled south in unusual numbers, the particular quality of the clouds building from the northwest. She brought the ewes inside, stocked extra firewood in the living quarters, and made sure the ventilation shafts were clear. When the temperature dropped to 12 below and the wind began to howl, Margaret and Catherine were safe inside their earth home. The fire burned steadily. The sheep below them added their warmth, and the temperature inside stayed at 62 degrees. "Mother," Catherine said, looking out their south-facing window at the blowing snow, "do you think Mr. Garrison and his boys are all right? Their cabin's well built. They'll be fine." But Margaret worried too. She'd grown to rely on Robert's steady presence, his practical knowledge, the way he treated Catherine with the same respect he showed adult workers. And more than that, if she was honest with herself, she'd come to look forward to seeing him, to the conversations they had while working, to the way he looked at her. Not with pity for her widowhood, but with something warmer. The storm lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, when the sun emerged and the temperature climbed to 0, there was a knock on their door. Robert Garrison stood there, half frozen, leading his horse. "The boys?" Margaret asked immediately, pulling him inside. "Safe at home. I needed to check on you both." "You rode out in this to check on us?" "I needed to know you'd survived." Catherine, with the intuition of 14-year-olds everywhere, suddenly remembered she needed to check on the sheep in the lower chamber and disappeared down the ladder, leaving Margaret and Robert alone. "The structure held," Margaret said, to fill the silence. "It performed exactly as designed. We've been warm and safe." "I worried," Robert admitted. "I know you're capable, Margaret, but that doesn't stop a man from worrying about people he cares for." Margaret met his eyes. He was a good man, steady and kind. Her heart, dormant since William's death, stirred with something she'd thought she might never feel again. "Robert, would you like some hot coffee? You must be frozen through." "I would. And Margaret, when spring comes, I'd like to talk to you about something. Not work, something more personal." "I'd like that too." Catherine reappeared at precisely the right moment, declaring the sheep perfectly content, and wasn't it wonderful how well their design was working? Over the next months, the 3-level structure proved itself. The sheep thrived in their lower chamber, protected from the worst of winter's cold by 8 feet of earth above them and the thermal mass of bedrock behind them. Margaret milked them twice daily, climbing down the ladder with her pail, working by lantern light in the cozy warmth their bodies generated. The living quarters stayed comfortable with minimal wood consumption. Margaret tracked her usage carefully. Just 40 pounds of wood per day in the coldest part of January. Compared to what she knew traditional cabins required, the fireplace drew perfectly, the chimney design allowing smoke to escape while retaining heat, and the cheese room above performed its own small miracle. The temperature there stayed between 40 and 45 degrees all winter, cold enough to age cheese properly, but warm enough that nothing froze. Margaret made her first wheels of sheep's milk cheese in January, following the recipe William's grandmother had passed down. The cheese aged beautifully in the cool, steady environment. The process required precision. Margaret had learned from William's careful notes. She heated the milk to exactly 90 degrees, added rennet made from sheep stomach lining she'd prepared herself, waited for the curd to form with the right consistency, firm enough to cut cleanly, but soft enough to release whey properly. She cut the curd into uniform cubes, stirred them gently as they expelled moisture, then pressed them into wooden molds lined with cheesecloth. The pressing took hours, gradually increasing weight to drive out moisture without crushing the delicate structure. Then came the salting, the careful attention to the developing rind, the daily turning to ensure even aging. In the cheese room above, with its steady temperature and controlled humidity, the wheels developed the complex flavors that would eventually make Davy's cheese sought after across the territory. Catherine learned alongside her mother, her steady hands and patient attention perfectly suited to the meticulous work. By the end of January, they had 12 wheels aging on wooden shelves Robert had built, each one marked with the date of production and Catherine's careful notes about the milk composition that day. By February, word of Margaret's success had spread. Women from nearby homesteads came to see the structure, to learn how she managed the 3 levels, to watch her milk the sheep and make cheese. She taught them freely, just as the Welsh grandmother had taught William. "You're sharing your knowledge," one woman said, surprised. "Knowledge isn't worth having if you keep it to yourself," Margaret replied. Martha Hendricks came back with 3 other women, all of them facing the challenge of keeping livestock alive through Wyoming winters in traditional surface barns that offered little protection against the brutal cold. Margaret walked them through the entire 3-level system, explaining the ventilation shafts that brought fresh air to the sheep while allowing their body heat to rise, the insulation properties of 8 feet of earth, the way the middle level captured and distributed warmth from both above and below. "We lose lambs every winter," one woman said quietly. "Last year, we lost half our flock when the temperature dropped to 40 below for a week. The barn just couldn't hold enough heat, even with fires burning day and night." Margaret showed them her sheep, healthy and content in their underground chamber where the temperature never dropped below 45 degrees, regardless of what the weather did outside. She showed them her records of wood consumption, a fraction of what traditional barns required. She walked them through the cheese room, explaining how the stable temperature meant she could age cheese reliably, producing a consistent product she could sell with confidence. "Could this work for cattle?" another woman asked. "The principle's the same," Margaret said. "You'd need a larger excavation, higher ceilings in the animal chamber, but yes, the earth doesn't care what kind of livestock you're keeping warm. It just holds the temperature steady." By the time the women left that afternoon, they were making plans, discussing how they might adapt Margaret's design to their own properties and livestock. Word spread further. The general store in Laramie started stocking her cheese in late February, and by March she had standing orders from 3 different merchants. Robert Garrison continued to visit regularly, helping with repairs and improvements, bringing his sons to learn. But increasingly, his visits extended past the work. He stayed for supper, talking with Margaret and Catherine about everything from sheep breeding to Catherine's education to the future of farming in the territory. In March, as the snow began to melt exactly along the drainage channels Margaret had designed, Robert asked Margaret to walk with him. They left Catherine practicing her letters by lamplight and walked out under a sky brilliant with stars. "Margaret," Robert said, "I've been alone since my wife passed 6 years ago. I never thought I'd want to change that. But watching you build this place, seeing your strength and your mind, the way you've raised Catherine to be thoughtful and brave, I find myself hoping for more than friendship." Margaret's heart beat faster. "I've thought the same, Robert. But I need you to understand, I won't give up this place, this work. It's not just a home. It's proof that William's dreams had merit, that a woman can build something lasting. I wouldn't ask you to give it up. I'd ask you to let me be part of it. You, Catherine, and me. My boys are nearly grown and will have their own lives soon, but the three of us could make a family, could build on what you've started here. They married in April, a simple ceremony at Reverend Thompson's church, with Catherine standing proud beside her mother and Thomas, and James flanking their father. The Davies Garrison family, as they came to be known, combined the two homesteads and expanded the sheep dairy operation. Robert built a second earth-sheltered structure on his property using Margaret's principles, and together they developed a system for year-round cheese production. Catherine, who had a gift for the work, began experimenting with different aging techniques, different herbs and seasonings. By 1880, the Davies Garrison cheese was sold in markets from Laramie to Cheyenne. People came from across the territory to study the earth-sheltered barns, to learn Margaret's methods. She taught them all, just as she'd been taught, freely, thoroughly, with the understanding that knowledge gained value by being shared. The three-level structure she'd built that first year stood solid through 20 more Wyoming winters. Other farmers adopted the design, modifying it for cattle, for root cellars, for living spaces that could withstand the brutal temperature swings of the high plains. Engineers came to measure and document, but the real proof was simpler. Families survived winters that would have killed them in traditional cabins. Margaret lived to see her grandchildren, Catherine having married Thomas Garrison, and made the family circle complete. She saw her cheese-making methods taught in agricultural schools, saw earth-sheltered building become an accepted practice in the territory. But what gave her the deepest satisfaction was something smaller and more personal. On a February evening in 1895, when she was 63 years old, Margaret stood with Robert watching the sunset over the Gallatin. They'd just come from the earth-sheltered barn where Catherine was teaching her own daughters to milk the sheep, to monitor temperatures, to understand how the three levels worked together as one breathing system. "We built something good," Robert said, taking her hand. "We did," Margaret agreed. "William dreamed it. Catherine and I started it, but you helped us finish it and made us a family. That's the best building of all." The Davies Garrison Sheep Dairy operated until 1923, when Catherine's children finally closed it after Margaret's death at 91 and Robert's passing at 94. The three-level structure stood for another 30 years after that, slowly weathering back into the hillside it had been carved from, but the knowledge didn't weather away. Margaret's methods, written down in her careful hand and preserved by her descendants, influenced a generation of Wyoming farmers. The principle was simple but profound: work with the land's natural properties rather than fighting against them. Use the earth's constant temperature. Let heat rise naturally. Build for the climate you have, not the one you wish you had. Modern agricultural historians recognize Margaret Davies as a pioneer in sustainable farming practices. Her three-level earth-sheltered design anticipated principles that wouldn't be formally articulated until decades later. But Margaret wasn't thinking about future movements. She was thinking about keeping her daughter warm, keeping sheep healthy, making cheese that would sell, and building a life when everyone said it couldn't be done. Catherine's diary, preserved by the Wyoming Historical Society, contains this entry from April 1878. "Mother married Mr. Garrison today. He is kind and steady, and he makes her happy. More importantly, he believes in her work and our design. Thomas and James are now my brothers. We are a family built on more than blood. on shared purpose and mutual respect. That's the real legacy of Margaret Davies, not just the innovative 3-level earth-sheltered barn that kept sheep warm and cheese cool and a mother and daughter safe through brutal winters, but the demonstration that practical wisdom and human connection could combine to create something stronger than either alone. The Davies Garrison story endures because it speaks to fundamental truths about human capability and resilience. It reminds us that old ways and new ways don't have to conflict, that a woman's vision and a man's support can complement rather than compete, and that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply having the courage to build what others say can't be built. Margaret Davies proved that you could survive impossible odds by thinking clearly about the problem instead of accepting conventional limitations. She proved that help could come from unexpected places, that family could be built by choice and shared work, and that true partnership meant supporting each other's strengths. The 3-level structure Margaret and Catherine designed that November in 1877, refined with Robert's help and proven through Wyoming's brutal winters, represented a fundamental shift in how people approached building in extreme environments. They stopped fighting the climate and started using it, accessing the thermal stability the earth provided freely to anyone willing to dig deep enough and think clearly enough to use it properly. Every family that survived a blizzard in an earth-sheltered home, every cheesemaker who used Margaret's methods, every farmer who learned that the land could be partner rather than adversary, they were all part of the legacy she built, not because she sought fame or recognition, but because she faced an immediate problem with practical determination and shared what she learned with anyone willing to listen. Margaret Davies built a 3-level earth-sheltered sheep dairy in Wyoming Territory in 1877. But more than that, she built a family, a future, and a foundation of knowledge that helped countless others build theirs. That's the story worth remembering, worth sharing, and worth building upon in whatever challenges we face today.